Sometimes the greatest strength comes from setting down your sword. Sometimes the fiercest warriors are the ones who choose to heal instead of harm. Asgrim the Wolf-Hewer was once the most feared hunter in the northern fjords. Now he raises orphaned children in a remote cabin at the edge of the world. When a storm brings healer Brynja to his door, she carries a secret that has haunted her for years. She cannot bear children. In her world, this makes her broken, worthless. But when she confesses this shame to the old warrior, he simply laughs. "Good," he tells her. "My cabin is already full of children who need love, not blood, to make them family." What follows is the story of how two wounded souls found healing in the most unexpected place. But when their past threatens everything they've built, will their newfound family survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the fjord like the voices of ancient gods, carrying with it the bite of early winter and the promise of harder days ahead. Snow had begun to dust the pine boughs that surrounded Asgrim's timber cabin, a sturdy structure built from the bones of fallen giants, massive logs hewn by his own hands during the first year of his exile from the world of blood and battle. Above the stone hearth, where flames danced and crackled against the gathering darkness, hung two artifacts that told the story of a man transformed. The storm-carved raven totem, its black wood polished smooth by years of firelight, perched like a guardian spirit watching over the household. Beside it, deliberately placed where all could see, hung Asgrim's retired battle-axe. The weapon that had once cleaved through shield walls and ended the lives of countless enemies now served only as a reminder of the path he had chosen to abandon. The cabin's main room buzzed with the comfortable chaos of children at their evening tasks. 6 young souls, each carrying their own story of loss and survival, had found sanctuary within these log walls. They ranged in age from little Sigrid, barely 7 winters old with braids the color of wheat, to Thorkel, nearly 15 and already showing the broad shoulders that marked him as his father's son. Sigrid sat cross-legged near the fire, her small fingers working to mend a torn tunic while she hummed an old lullaby her mother had sung before the fever took her. Beside her, twin brothers Eric and Olaf, both 10 winters, argued quietly over a game of carved bone dice, their red hair catching the firelight like copper flames. These boys had arrived 3 summers past, orphaned when raiders burned their village to ash. Thorkel worked at the grinding stone, preparing grain for tomorrow's bread, his jaw set with the determination of one forced to grow up too quickly. His sister Astrid, 2 years younger but equally serious, sorted through the day's gathered herbs and roots, her knowledge of woodcraft already rivaling that of seasoned hunters. The youngest boy, Bjorn, only 9 but fierce as his namesake bear, whittled a new arrow shaft while keeping one eye on the door, still expecting enemies that would never come. This was Asgrim's true legacy. Not the songs of his battlefield prowess that bards still sang in distant halls, but the quiet sanctuary he had built for the forgotten. Each child had come to him broken in their own way, carrying wounds both visible and hidden. Yet here, in this place where strength was measured not by the sharpness of one's blade, but by the depth of one's patience, they had begun to heal. Asgrim himself sat in his carved chair. A massive seat hewn from a single piece of oak, its arms worn smooth by years of use. At 53 winters, he bore the scars of countless battles, a white line across his left cheek where a Saxon blade had kissed him, fingers on his right hand that no longer bent quite straight from too many sword grips, and eyes that held the weight of all the lives he had taken before choosing a different path. His beard, once golden like the sun on summer wheat, had turned silver as moonlight on snow. Yet his frame remained powerful, broad shoulders speaking of strength that age had seasoned rather than diminished. When he moved, it was with the careful grace of a man who had learned that true power lay in restraint. The transformation had not come easily. 7 years ago, after returning from what he had sworn would be his final raid, Asgrim had found himself unable to wash the blood from his hands, no matter how hard he scrubbed. The faces of the fallen haunted his dreams, not just enemies, but the innocent caught in war's merciless tide. When the first orphaned child had appeared at his door, a girl no older than Sigrid, whose parents had died in a raid he himself had led, something fundamental had shifted in the depths of his soul. He had taken her in, then another, then more, until his cabin had become a refuge for the casualties of a violent world. The other warriors mocked him at first, calling him soft, saying the Wolf-Hewer had lost his fangs. Let them, he had decided. He had killed enough for 3 lifetimes. Now he would see if he could save even a few, tonight. As the storm raged beyond the walls and the children settled into their evening routines, Asgrim found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the newest member of their household. Brynja sat at the smaller table near the window, grinding herbs with a practiced hand. Her dark hair streaked with premature silver, and her green eyes holding depths that spoke of sorrows she had not yet shared. She had arrived 3 days ago, seeking shelter from the very storm that still battered the fjord. Travel-worn and weary, she had stood in his doorway with her healer's satchel clutched tight against her chest and eyes that held too much pain for someone who dedicated her life to easing the suffering of others. When she had spoken her confession that she was barren, that she could never give life as women were meant to do, he had seen the shame that carved itself deep into her soul. But Asgrim had lived long enough to recognize that some wounds ran deeper than flesh, and some strengths could only be found in what the world called weakness. His laughter had been gentle, understanding, perhaps the first kindness she had received in longer than she cared to remember. The children had been cautious at first, as they always were with strangers. Too many had learned too young that not all adults could be trusted. But Brynja possessed something rare, a gift for seeing the person behind the pain, the child behind the defensive walls they had built. When Eric had scraped his knee badly while fetching wood that first day, she had tended to him with such gentle skill that even Thorkel, ever protective of his younger charges, had begun to relax his guard. Now, as she worked by lamplight, her movements precise and economical, Asgrim could see how naturally she fit into the rhythm of their lives. She rose before dawn to check the herb stores, spent the day teaching Astrid new healing techniques, and had already earned little Sigrid's complete devotion by braiding flowers into her hair and telling stories of the places she had traveled. Yet beneath her competence lay something fragile, a woman who had been told too often that her value lay only in what she could not do, rather than in the gifts she freely gave. The world beyond these walls judged harshly, measuring worth by traditional standards that left no room for different kinds of strength. The fire settled with a soft hiss, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the wind continued its ancient song, but within the cabin's walls, peace reigned. This was what Asgrim had built, not just shelter from the storm, but sanctuary from a world that too often confused might with right. As the evening deepened and the children began their journey toward sleep, Asgrim caught Brynja's eye across the room. In that shared glance lay understanding, 2 souls who had found their way to this place, not despite their wounds, but because of them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as it always did. But tonight, in this place where love was measured not by blood but by choice, they were home. The fever came in the night like a thief, stealing little Bjorn's strength while the household slept. Asgrim woke to the sound of labored breathing and found the boy burning with heat that seemed to radiate from his small frame like a forge fire. His usual fierce demeanor had been replaced by the vulnerability of a child fighting a battle his wooden sword could not win. "Brynja," Asgrim called softly, his voice carrying the urgency that came from watching too many children lost to sickness in harder times. She appeared at his side within moments, her healing satchel already in hand, the worn leather bag that had traveled countless miles and held remedies gathered from distant lands and ancient wisdom passed down through generations of healers. Her fingers pressed against Bjorn's fevered brow, and Asgrim saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of old fears. Memories of times when her skills had not been enough. The boy's breathing was shallow, rapid, and when she lifted his eyelids, his eyes rolled back, showing only white. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands, as she unpacked her supplies. "I found him this way, moments ago. He was fine at evening meal." The other children had begun to stir, drawn by the hushed urgency in the adults' voices. Thorkel appeared first, his protective instincts sharp even in sleep, followed by Astrid, with her quick understanding of anything that touched on healing arts. The twins and little Sigrid clustered in the doorway, their eyes wide, with the particular fear that came to children who'd already lost too much. Brynja's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Asgrim could see the doubt that crept into her movements. She mixed powders and crushed herbs, creating poultices and tinctures with the skill of someone who had done this countless times before. Yet beneath her competence lay something fragile, the fear of a healer who had failed when it mattered most. "The fever burns too hot," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "If I cannot break it soon—" She stopped herself, unwilling to voice the possibility that haunted every caregiver's nightmare. Asgrim knelt beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped hold Bjorn steady while she administered her remedies. "Tell me what you need." "Snow," she said without hesitation. "We must cool him gradually. And willow bark. Do you have willow bark?" "Astrid knows where it grows, even in winter." He turned to the girl, who nodded quickly and disappeared into the storm-lashed night with the fearlessness of youth and purpose. What followed were the longest hours any of them had known. Brynja worked tirelessly, applying cold compresses, forcing drops of medicine between Bjorn's parched lips, monitoring every change in his breathing and heartbeat. The other children took turns helping, Thorkel fetching fresh snow, the twins keeping the fire at just the right height, Sigrid simply sitting nearby and humming the lullabies that had once comforted her in her own dark moments. But it was Asgrim's quiet faith that sustained them all. While Brynja battled her own demons, the voice that whispered she was broken, useless, that this child would die because she was not enough. The former warrior sat vigil with the patience of a man who had learned that some battles could not be won with strength alone. "Should have caught this sooner," Brynja whispered during the darkest hour before dawn, when Bjorn's fever had spiked again and his small body convulsed with chills. "A real healer would have seen the signs." "A real healer," Asgrim said quietly, "is someone who fights for life even when death seems certain. You are here, doing everything that can be done. That is enough." His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and something in Brynja's chest loosened. A knot of self-doubt that had been pulled tight for so many years, she had forgotten how to breathe without it. She returned to her work with renewed focus, and as the first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's windows, Bjorn's fever finally broke. The boy's breathing deepened, his color improved, and when his eyes opened for the first time in hours, they were clear and aware. He looked up at the faces surrounding him, concerned, relieved, full of love, and managed a weak smile. "Did I miss morning chores?" he asked, and the laughter that erupted from the gathered children was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. As Bjorn recovered over the following days, something fundamental shifted in the household dynamics. The children, who had accepted Brynja's presence with cautious politeness, now looked at her with the complete trust reserved for those who had proven themselves when it mattered most. She had fought for one of their own and won. That was a bond deeper than blood, but the peace was shattered on the morning of the fourth day when a messenger arrived at their door. Gunnar Ironarm, one of Asgrim's former battle companions, rode up through the snow with news that carried the chill of more than winter wind. "The Jarls are talking." "Wolf-Hewer," Gunnar said without preamble, steam rising from his horse's flanks in the cold air. His eyes swept over the children who had gathered to see the visitor, taking in their healthy faces and comfortable clothing, the obvious care with which they were tended. "They say you've grown soft, that you harbor strays, like a woman tends wounded birds." Asgrim's expression remained calm, but Brynja noticed how his hand instinctively moved toward where his axe would once have hung at his side. What the Jarls say is their concern. These children are mine, not just the children they're questioning now. Gunnar's gaze settled on Brynja with the uncomfortable intensity of a man unused to seeing women in roles beyond the traditional. Word has spread about your healer woman. Some say she practices strange arts, that she came here under suspicious circumstances. There are whispers. There are always whispers, Asgrim interrupted, his voice carrying the edge that had once made enemies flee before him. Men who have nothing meaningful to occupy their time find entertainment in the affairs of others. This is different, old friend. Jarl Eric Bloodaxe himself has taken interest. He questions whether the Wolf-Hewer has forgotten his duties to his people, whether foreign influences have clouded your judgment. Gunnar's voice dropped lower. He speaks of sending men to evaluate your household, to determine if you remain fit to hold lands in his territory. The words hung in the cold air like a blade suspended over their peace. Brynja felt the children move unconsciously closer to Asgrim, their instincts sharp enough to recognize threat even when they didn't fully understand its nature. She saw in their faces the particular fear of those who had already lost one home and could not bear to lose another. When? Asgrim asked simply. Before the next full moon. Perhaps sooner if the weather clears. Gunnar's expression softened slightly. I came to warn you because we once fought side by side, but I cannot do more than that. The old ways are changing, Asgrim. Some say not for the better. After Gunnar departed, the cabin fell into an uneasy quiet. The children went about their chores with subdued efficiency, while Brynja found herself studying every shadow as if threats might materialize from the very walls that had begun to feel like home. That evening, as they gathered around the fire, Asgrim spoke words that would reshape all their futures. We have choices to make. Each of us must decide what we value most, our safety or our convictions, our reputation or our family. His eyes met each of theirs in turn. I know what I choose, but the path ahead will not be easy. Brynja touched her healing satchel where it rested beside her chair, feeling the weight of herbs and remedies that represented not just her skills, but her identity as someone who chose healing over harm. For the first time since arriving at this sanctuary, she began to consider that staying might require more courage than leaving. The storm outside had finally passed. But a new tempest was gathering, one that would test not just their resolve, but the very bonds that had begun to make them a family. The days following Gunnar's warning settled into a rhythm of careful preparation and growing unease. Asgrim moved through the cabin like a man preparing for siege, checking the strength of door bars, ensuring their stores of food and medicine could sustain them through a longer winter, if necessary. Yet he did so with the quiet efficiency that kept the children from panic, turning preparation into simply another aspect of their daily routine. Brynja found herself drawn repeatedly to the small wooden chest that held her most precious possessions, a collection of rare healing stones, passed down through generations of women in her family. Each smooth river rock had been carved with symbols that represented different aspects of the healing arts: the spiral for renewal, the tree for growth, the wave for cleansing. Her grandmother had pressed them into her hands with words that echoed now across the years. These will guide you when your heart grows uncertain, child. Trust in what you know to be true. She held the stones now as she watched the children through the cabin's window. They played in the snow with the resilience of youth, their laughter carrying on the crisp air like birdsong. But she noticed how Thorkel kept glancing toward the forest edge, how Astrid stayed closer to the cabin than usual, how little Sigrid's games had taken on themes of hiding and seeking safety. They sensed the change coming, Asgrim said, joining her at the window. His breath misted in the cold air that seeped through the wooden frame. Children always do. They read the world differently than we do, through feelings rather than words. In my travels, I've seen what happens when traditional ways clash with different choices, Brynja replied, her fingers tracing the carved symbols on one of the healing stones. The innocent always pay the highest price. Asgrim was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile. "You speak as one who has paid such prices herself." The observation hit closer to truth than she was ready to acknowledge. In the village where she was born, her inability to bear children had marked her as cursed, broken, a woman who served no purpose in a society that measured female worth through motherhood. The whispers had followed her wherever she went. "There goes the barren one, useless as a field in drought, blessed by the gods, only with the gift to ease others' pain, since she could not create life herself. We all carry scars," she said finally. "Some are simply more visible than others." That afternoon brought an unexpected test of their resolve. Young Eric, the more adventurous of the twins, had wandered farther than usual while checking their snares and returned with news that chilled them more thoroughly than the winter wind. He had seen riders in the distance, 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of those on official business. They wore Jarl Eric's colors, Eric reported, his red hair bright against his flushed cheeks. And they were asking questions at Thorir's farm about strangers in the area. Thorir's farm lay only half a day's ride from their cabin. If the Jarl's men were making inquiries there, it would not be long before their attention turned to Asgrim's isolated household. "How long before they reach us?" Asgrim asked, his voice betraying none of the tension that Brynja could see in the set of his shoulders. "Tomorrow, perhaps the day after if the snow slows them," Eric answered. Asgrim nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. "Then we have time to decide how we meet them." That evening, as the children slept, Asgrim and Brynja sat by the dying fire and spoke in low voices about choices that would define their future. The conversation meandered through practical considerations, whether to meet the riders openly or attempt to hide Brynja's presence, how to present their household in the most favorable light, what arguments might sway men whose minds were already made up. But beneath the practical planning lay deeper questions that neither quite dared voice. What they had built here was fragile, beautiful, and utterly at odds with the expectations of their world. Could love truly triumph over tradition? Could a family forged by choice prove stronger than one bound by blood? "I could leave," Brynja said quietly, voicing the thought that had haunted her since Gunnar's visit. "If my presence brings danger to the children, running solves nothing," Asgrim interrupted, his voice firm. "You belong here now. The children know it, I know it, and somewhere in your heart you know it too." He leaned forward, the firelight casting deep shadows across his weathered face. "I have run from enough battles to know that some fights cannot be avoided, only postponed. Better to face this with courage than to scatter like leaves before the wind." "You speak of courage, but what of wisdom? Sometimes the wise choice is retreat, and sometimes," he replied, "wisdom lies in knowing what is worth defending, regardless of the cost." Outside, the wind howled through the pine branches, a sound that seemed to carry echoes of the conflicts to come. Brynja touched her healing stones again, seeking the calm that had always come from their smooth surfaces and ancient wisdom. But tonight, even their familiar comfort felt insufficient against the magnitude of what they faced. The next morning brought an unexpected reprieve. Heavy snow began falling before dawn, thick flakes that would slow any riders and provide additional time to prepare. Asgrim used the delay to teach the older children basic defensive positions, not to fight, he assured them, but to know where to go if trouble came. He showed them the hidden root cellar beneath the cabin's floor, a space he had excavated years ago for storing winter provisions, but which could serve as refuge if needed. Brynja spent the day preparing remedies that might prove useful. Salves for wounds, tinctures for calming nerves, powders that could induce sleep in hostile visitors if circumstances demanded such measures. Her hands worked automatically while her mind wrestled with the growing certainty that their peaceful existence was about to face its greatest test. As evening approached and the snow continued to fall, she found herself standing once again at the window, watching the children help Asgrim secure the cabin against the storm. There was Thorkel, serious and dependable, carrying firewood with the steady strength of someone determined to protect what mattered. Astrid worked beside him, her knowledge of herb lore already rivaling that of many adult healers. The twins moved in their synchronized way, each anticipating the other's needs, while little Sigrid and fierce Bjorn contributed what they could with the eager helpfulness of the young. This was what they would be defending, not just a building or a way of life, but the bonds that had transformed a collection of wounded individuals into something precious and rare. A family built not on the accidents of birth, but on the deliberate choice to care for one another. She felt Asgrim's presence beside her before he spoke. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "we face it together. That is what families do." Brynja nodded, her hand closing around the healing stones in her pocket. For the first time since Gunnar's warning, she felt a spark of something that might have been hope. They had survived the storms of their past, weathered the crisis of Bjorn's illness, and grown stronger through each challenge. Perhaps they could survive this too. The riders arrived on the second day after the snowfall, their horses leaving deep tracks in the pristine white that blanketed the forest floor. Brynja watched from the cabin's window as 3 figures emerged from the tree line, their movements deliberate and unhurried, the pace of men confident in their authority and purpose. Asgrim stood in the doorway, filling the frame with his considerable presence. At his side hung his father's oath ring, a simple band of silver twisted with gold that marked him as a man of standing, despite his chosen isolation. The ring had belonged to his bloodline for 5 generations, passed from father to son as a symbol of honor and commitment to the old ways. Today, it served as a reminder that he had not abandoned his heritage, merely chosen to interpret it differently. The lead rider dismounted with practiced ease, his cloak bearing the raven emblem of Jarl Eric Bloodaxe. He was younger than Asgrim expected, perhaps 30 winters, with the lean build of a man who had earned his position through skill rather than birthright. His eyes swept over the cabin's exterior, taking in the well-maintained structure, the carefully stacked firewood, the signs of a household run with competence and care. "I am Ragnar Eriksson, speaking for my father the Jarl," the young man announced, his voice carrying formal authority. "I come to inquire about the composition of this household and certain concerns that have been raised regarding foreign influences." "You are welcome to my hearth," Asgrim replied, the ritual words of hospitality spoken with careful correctness. "I am Asgrim, called Wolf-Hewer, and this is my home." The 2 companions who flanked Ragnar remained mounted, their hands resting casually on sword hilts, not threatening, but ready. Brynja recognized the positioning from her years of travel through contested territories. These were seasoned warriors who knew how to project strength without overt aggression. "May we enter?" Ragnar asked, though the question carried the weight of command rather than request. Inside the cabin's warmth, the children had arranged themselves with the careful discipline Asgrim had taught them. Thorkel stood near the hearth, his young face serious but unafraid. Astrid worked at her herb preparation, her movement steady despite the tension that filled the room. The twins sat at their table, sharing a book of runes that Asgrim had been teaching them to read, while Sigrid played quietly with a wooden doll near Brynja's feet. Little Bjorn, still pale from his recent illness, remained close to Asgrim's chair, his fierce loyalty evident in every line of his small body. Ragnar's eyes moved systematically through the room, cataloguing details with the thoroughness of a man trained to assess threats and opportunities. Brynja felt his gaze linger on her, noting her foreign-style clothing, the healing implements that marked her profession, the way the children seemed to accept her presence as natural. "These are your children?" Ragnar asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "They are under my protection," Asgrim replied carefully. "Each came to me in need, and each has found home here. And the woman? Brynja is a healer who sought shelter from the storm. She has proven herself valuable to our household." Ragnar's expression remained neutral, but Brynja caught the slight narrowing of his eyes that suggested skepticism. "It is unusual for a warrior of your reputation to gather strays like this. Some wonder if your years of isolation have affected your judgment." The insult was delivered with the casual cruelty of youth, and Brynja saw Thorkel stiffen in response. But Asgrim's voice remained level, controlled. I have learned that true strength sometimes lies in protection rather than destruction. These children are not strays. They are survivors who deserved better than the world gave them. Pretty words, Ragnar said, moving to examine the artifacts on the walls. His fingers traced the carved raven totem above the hearth, then moved to Asgrim's retired battle-axe. But the Jarl questions whether sentiment has replaced wisdom. He wonders if foreign influences, his gaze flicked toward Brynja, have corrupted the judgment of one who once served as his most trusted hunter. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Brynja felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The knowledge that her presence had brought this scrutiny, that her inability to bear children had somehow translated into suspicion of darker inadequacies. If Jarl Erik has concerns about my loyalty, Asgrim said, his voice carrying an edge that reminded everyone present why he had once been feared across the northern seas. Perhaps he should speak them directly rather than sending others to peer into corners like suspicious housewives. Ragnar's companions shifted slightly in their seats, hands moving closer to weapons. But the young man himself smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth. My father remembers when you would not have spoken so boldly to his representatives. Perhaps time has indeed changed you, Wolf-Hewer. Time changes all men, Asgrim replied. The wise learn from it. During this exchange, Brynja had been quietly observing the dynamics at play. She noticed how Ragnar's attention kept returning to the children, how he studied their faces and bearing with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating potential threats or assets. There was something predatory in his assessment that made her skin crawl. These children, Ragnar said suddenly, addressing them directly for the first time. You are content here. You understand that your guardian has chosen a path that sets him apart from traditional ways. Thorkel answered without hesitation, his young voice steady. Asgrim saved us when no one else would. He has taught us strength, honor, and the courage to protect those weaker than ourselves. And what of you? Ragnar turned to Astrid. A girl your age should be learning the proper arts of womanhood, not playing with herbs like some hedge witch. The insult to Brynja was implicit but clear. Astrid's chin lifted with pride that echoed her guardian's bearing. I learn what serves life rather than ending it. Brynja has shown me that healing is as noble as any warrior's calling. Ragnar's expression darkened at this response, and Brynja realized they had walked into a trap more subtle than she had first understood. This was not merely an investigation, it was a test designed to reveal the full extent of their deviation from accepted norms. The Jarl will be interested to hear how his former champion has raised his charges, Ragnar said, standing to leave. We have learned what we came to discover. As the riders departed, their horses disappearing once again into the forest depths, an oppressive silence settled over the cabin. The children clustered closer together, their earlier confidence shaken by the naked hostility they had witnessed. Asgrim touched his father's oath ring, turning the ancient silver thoughtfully. Now we know what we truly face, he said quietly. This was never about tradition or loyalty. Someone wants what we have built here, and they will use any excuse to take it. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it the promise of harder storms ahead. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet before Brynja discovered the true nature of the threat they faced. She had risen before dawn, as was her custom, to check the snares Thorkel had set along the forest's edge. The morning mist clung to the snow-covered ground like spirits reluctant to depart, and her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she moved carefully through the familiar paths. It was there, hidden beneath a fallen log where she often gathered winter mushrooms, that she found the small wooden token carved with the symbol of a wolf's head split by an axe. The carving was crude, but unmistakable, a message meant for Asgrim that spoke of challenges older than the Jarl's suspicions. Someone from his warrior past had found him, And they had not come seeking reconciliation. She carried the token back to the cabin, where Asgrim was preparing the morning meal with the quiet efficiency that marked all his movements. The children still slept, their breathing creating a gentle chorus that had become the soundtrack of her contentment. When she placed the carved wood in his palm, she watched his face transform from puzzled concern to something much darker. "Where?" he asked simply. "Near the eastern snares. Hidden deliberately, but placed where I would find it during my morning rounds." Asgrim's fingers closed around the token, his knuckles whitening with the pressure of old memories. The carved symbol belonged to Bjorn Ironside, not their young Bjorn who slept peacefully in the loft above, but a man whose name carried weight and menace across the northern territories. When they had fought side by side in the blood-soaked campaigns that built reputations and filled grave mounds. But their last parting had been bitter, marked by Bjorn's fury at what he saw as Asgrim's betrayal of everything they had once stood for. "He knows about the children," Asgrim said, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Bjorn Ironside never leaves tokens unless he intends to collect what he believes is owed." Around Brynja's neck hung her grandmother's memory pendant, a small silver locket containing dried herbs that had been blessed by 3 generations of healing women. The pendant had been her anchor through every crisis, a reminder that wisdom often came not from strength, but from understanding the deeper currents that moved beneath surface events. She touched it now, seeking the clarity that had guided her through darker times. "What does he believe you owe him?" she asked, though something in the set of Asgrim's shoulders told her she would not welcome the answer. The story emerged slowly, like poison drawn from an infected wound. Years ago, during their last raid together, they had taken a wealthy monastery that housed not only gold and silver, but also a dozen young novices, boys no older than Thorkel, their lives held forfeit according to the brutal customs of their calling. Asgrim had seen something in their frightened faces that reminded him of his own youth, when he had been torn from his family by raiders and forced to earn survival through violence. He had argued for mercy, had fought his own companions when they refused, and in the end had helped the boys escape under cover of darkness. The act had cost them significant plunder and, more importantly, had marked Asgrim as unreliable in the eyes of those who valued gold over conscience. Bjorn Ironside had sworn an oath that night that one day he would collect what Asgrim's weakness had cost them, with interest paid in suffering. "He cannot reach me directly," Asgrim explained, his voice heavy with the weight of old regrets. "But the children represent everything I chose to protect instead of destroy. In his mind, they are payment for what he believes I stole from him." The implications settled over Brynja like a shroud. This was not about politics or tradition. This was personal vengeance that would use innocent lives as currency. She thought of Bjorn Ironside's reputation, stories she had heard whispered in healing circles about a man who took particular pleasure in breaking what others treasured most. "How many men does he command?" she asked, her mind already working through defensive possibilities and escape routes. "Too many for us to fight directly. But Bjorn has always been clever. He will not come as a raider. He will find ways to make his actions appear justified, perhaps even legal under the Jarl's authority." Asgrim's expression grew thoughtful. "The visit from Ragnar makes more sense now. Someone has been whispering poison in influential ears, preparing the ground for whatever Bjorn has planned." That afternoon, while the children worked at their lessons, Asgrim and Brynja walked the perimeter of their small domain, identifying defensive positions and escape routes with the grim efficiency of those who understood that planning for the worst often prevented it from occurring. The forest that had once been their sanctuary now felt different, full of shadows where enemies might hide, paths that could become traps, clearings that offered no cover. "There is another option," Brynja said, as they paused near the old oak where she had first taught Astrid to identify medicinal bark. "I could leave. If my presence is what has triggered this attention—" "Your presence has triggered nothing," Asgrim interrupted with quiet firmness. Bjorn Ironside would have found excuse for his vengeance with or without you here. The only difference your staying makes is that we face this threat together rather than apart. But if the children are his target, then they need every protector they can have. Your healing skills, your knowledge of plants and poisons, your ability to see threats from angles a warrior might miss, all of these make us stronger, not weaker. As they returned to the cabin, Brynja found herself studying the faces of the children with new intensity. Thorkel's serious determination, Astrid's quick intelligence, the twins' synchronized awareness, Sigrid's trusting innocence, and little Bjorn's fierce loyalty, each represented something precious that their enemies would seek to destroy simply because it mattered to Asgrim. That evening, as the family gathered around the fire for their usual time of stories and quiet conversation, Brynja made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. She reached into her healing satchel and withdrew a small vial of rare amber oil, a treasure that represented years of careful gathering and preparation. "I want to teach you something," she told the children, holding up the vial so that the firelight caught the golden liquid within. "This oil comes from trees that have stood for hundreds of years, and it carries the memory of storms they have survived. Tomorrow we will learn how such memories can protect us when our own strength alone is not enough." The children leaned forward with the eager attention they always gave to new knowledge, unaware that they were receiving their first lesson in the arts of survival that might soon mean the difference between life and death. But Asgrim understood, and in his eyes Brynja saw something that might have been gratitude mixed with a deeper emotion she was not yet ready to name. Outside, the wind continued its restless song through the pines, but inside the cabin's walls, the bonds that made them a family grew stronger with each shared breath, each moment of connection that their enemies would never understand, and therefore could never truly defeat. The lessons began at first light, when the mist still clung to the forest floor and the children's breath formed small clouds in the crisp air. Brynja had spent the night in preparation, grinding herbs and mixing compounds that would serve as both teaching tools and potential defenses. Her hands worked by lamplight, guided by knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to protect their families through wit rather than warfare. At the center of her preparations lay an ancient iron key, not for any lock in the physical world, but a ceremonial piece that had belonged to her great-grandmother, a woman legendary for her ability to unlock the secrets of plant lore and natural defenses. The key had been forged in the shape of a twisted branch, its surface etched with symbols that represented the connection between growth and protection, life and the wisdom to preserve it. "Gather close," Brynja told the children as they assembled in the clearing behind the cabin. The early morning light filtered through the pine branches, creating patterns of shadow and gold that shifted with each breeze. "Today you will learn that strength comes in many forms, and the greatest warriors are often those who never draw a blade." She began with the amber oil, showing them how a few drops applied to specific points could mask human scent from tracking dogs, how it could be mixed with other compounds to create smoke that would confuse and disorient attackers. Astrid absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge might soon become survival, while Thorkel asked practical questions about application and duration. The twins worked together to memorize the locations of plants that could serve multiple purposes, some for healing, others for protection, a few that could incapacitate without killing if the need arose. Little Sigrid proved surprisingly adept at spotting the subtle differences between beneficial and harmful varieties. Her young eyes sharp for details that escaped older observers. Even young Bjorn, still recovering from his fever but determined not to be left behind, contributed by testing his small fingers' ability to work with the delicate mechanisms Brynja showed them. How to set snares that would delay rather than trap, how to create warning systems using natural materials that would alert them to approaching danger. These skills are not about causing harm, Brynja emphasized as they worked. They are about buying time, creating opportunities, giving ourselves choices when others would take them away. As the morning progressed, Asgrim joined their training, adding his own knowledge of forest craft and defensive positioning. But Brynja noticed how his attention kept drifting to the tree line, how his hand unconsciously checked the position of weapons he no longer habitually carried. The weight of Bjorn Ironside's threat pressed on him like a physical burden, made heavier by the knowledge that his own past choices had brought danger to those he now sought to protect. The first test of their preparations came sooner than expected. That afternoon, while the children practiced their new skills in the relative safety of the cabin's vicinity, a stranger approached from the southern path, a woman traveling alone, which was unusual enough to warrant careful attention. She was perhaps 40 winters old, with the worn clothing and cautious demeanor of someone who had learned to navigate the world's dangers through careful observation rather than force. Her pack was modest but well organized, and she moved with the economical grace of someone accustomed to long journeys on foot. "I seek shelter for the night," she called from the forest edge, following the proper protocols for approaching an unknown household. "I am Ingrid, called Far Walker, and I carry news from the southern settlements." Asgrim studied her carefully before responding. "You are welcome to our fire, traveler. What news do you bring?" As they gathered around the hearth that evening, Ingrid's story unfolded like a map of gathering storms. She spoke of increased raiding activity in the coastal regions, of jarls consolidating power and traditional households being pressured to conform to newer, harsher interpretations of the old ways. But it was her casual mention of a particular name that made Asgrim's blood run cold. "Bjorn Ironside has been gathering men," she said, unaware of the impact her words carried. "They say he seeks to settle old debts and cleanse the land of influences that weaken traditional strength. His warband has grown to nearly 30 warriors, all seasoned fighters who share his views about the proper order of things." Brynja felt the children tense around her, their newly learned skills suddenly taking on immediate relevance. The iron key at her throat seemed to grow heavier, as if the weight of her ancestors' wisdom was settling more fully on her shoulders. "Has he spoken of specific targets?" Asgrim asked, his voice carefully neutral. "None by name, but he speaks often of a former companion who chose weakness over strength, who corrupts children with foreign ideas and harbors influences that threaten the purity of our ways." Ingrid's eyes moved thoughtfully around the cabin, taking in the mixed composition of their household. "He has convinced several jarls that such corruption must be rooted out before it spreads." The implications were clear. Bjorn had spent months building political support for his vengeance, framing his personal grudge as a righteous crusade to preserve traditional values. The children were not just targets, they were symbols of everything he claimed to oppose. That night, after Ingrid had settled into the guest alcove, and the children had been tucked into their beds, Asgrim and Brynja sat by the dying fire and spoke in whispers about choices that could no longer be delayed. "We cannot fight 30 seasoned warriors," Asgrim said, stating the obvious truth they both understood. "But we cannot flee with 6 children through winter wilderness either." "There might be another way," Brynja replied, her fingers unconsciously tracing the iron key's twisted surface. "My great-grandmother once told stories of how the wisest protectors sometimes won their greatest victories without engaging in battle at all. She spoke of misdirection and hidden strengths, of allies that could be found in unexpected places, of the power that came from understanding your enemy's weaknesses better than they understood your own. The plan that emerged from their whispered conversation was complex, dangerous, and dependent on perfect timing. But as Brynja looked around the cabin at the sleeping forms of the children they both loved, she felt a certainty settle in her chest like warm honey. They had found something worth defending here, not just a household, but a new way of defining family strength and purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced every challenge since she first arrived at their door. Together, with wisdom as their weapon and love as their shield, The iron key grew warm against her skin, as if her great-grandmother's spirit approved of the path they had chosen. Tomorrow would bring the first steps of a plan that would test everything they had learned about the difference between surviving and truly living. Outside, the wind sang through the pines with what almost sounded like encouragement, carrying their whispered plans toward a future that remained unwritten but no longer felt impossible to achieve. The revelation came wrapped in the innocent words of a child who spoke more truth than she knew. 3 days after Ingrid's departure, as Brynja worked with little Sigrid to identify the different varieties of winter berries that clung to frosted branches, the girl made an observation that changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. The pretty lady who stayed with us had the same mark on her hand as the mean man who came before, Sigrid said, holding up a cluster of red berries for Brynja's inspection. Right here on the soft part between her thumb and finger, like a tiny star but darker, Brynja's hands stilled on the branch she had been examining. Ingrid Farwalker had indeed borne a small tattoo in that exact location, a mark so subtle that only a child's observant eyes might have noticed it during casual interaction. But more troubling was Sigrid's description of seeing the same mark on Ragnar Eriksson during his visit days earlier. That mark was not random decoration. In the hidden networks that connected those who traded in information and influence across the Northern Territories, such tattoos served as recognition symbols, ways for agents to identify each other without revealing their true purposes to outsiders. Brynja had seen similar markings during her travels, usually on merchants who served multiple masters or spies who gathered intelligence under the guise of legitimate business. The implications struck her like a physical blow. Ingrid's timely arrival, her detailed knowledge of Bjorn Ironside's movements, her casual mention of exactly the information that would create maximum anxiety. None of it had been coincidence. She had been sent to assess their defenses, to gauge their reactions, to report back on the best approaches for the attack that was surely coming. But there was something even more disturbing in this revelation. If Ragnar Eriksson bore the same mark, it meant that Jarl Erik's investigation had been coordinated with Bjorn Ironside from the beginning. The official scrutiny and the personal vendetta were not separate threats. They were parts of a single, carefully orchestrated campaign designed to legitimize what would otherwise be viewed as simple murder and theft. Brynja felt her grandmother's memory pendant grow warm against her skin, as if the spirit of the old healer was trying to send a warning across the veil between worlds. She knelt down to Sigrid's eye level, her voice carefully controlled, despite the urgency she felt. "Sigrid, this is very important. Can you remember exactly where you saw this mark on both people? Show me on your own hand." The child demonstrated with the precise accuracy that made her such a gifted student of plant lore. The location was specific, deliberate, not a casual decoration, but a carefully placed identifier that would be visible during certain gestures while remaining hidden during normal interaction. "You did very well to notice this," Brynja told her, forcing a smile despite the fear that was building in her chest. "Can you keep this as our special secret for now? Just between us?" Sigrid nodded solemnly, understanding that adult secrets often carried weight beyond their apparent importance. As they returned to the cabin, Brynja's mind raced through the implications of what they had discovered. Every assumption they had made about their enemies, every plan they had developed based on incomplete information, needed to be reconsidered in light of this new understanding. That evening, she waited until the children were settled for the night before sharing her discovery with Asgrim. His reaction was immediate and visceral, the controlled fury of a warrior who realized he had been outmaneuvered by opponents he had underestimated. 30 warriors, he said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm that had once made enemies flee before him. That was never the real threat. The real threat is that they have legal justification for whatever they plan to do. They sat in the darkness near the window, speaking in whispers while the wind howled through the pines outside. The ancient runestone that served as the cabin's foundation Stone seemed to pulse with hidden energy, a massive piece of carved granite that had marked this place as significant. Long before Asgrim had built his sanctuary here, tonight, the runes carved into its surface seemed to glow faintly in the starlight, as if ancient powers were stirring in response to modern dangers. If Jarl Erik is involved, then resistance becomes treason, Brynja said. Working through the political implications, any attempt to protect the children could be framed as defying legitimate authority. Unless, Asgrim replied slowly, we can prove that the authority itself is corrupt. The idea that formed between them was audacious, dangerous and dependent on resources they did not possess. But as they explored its possibilities, a different kind of hope began to emerge. Not the hope of simple survival, but the possibility of exposing the conspiracy that threatened not just their family, but other unconventional households. Throughout the region, the ancient runestone held secrets that even Asgrim had not fully explored. According to local tradition, it marked a place where the old gods had once granted sanctuary to those who sought justice against corrupt rulers. The runes themselves told a story of ancient laws that superseded the authority of earthly jarls, laws that recognized the right of the innocent to seek protection from those who would abuse power for personal gain. The old ways that Bjorn claims to defend included provisions for challenging corrupt authority. Asgrim explained, his knowledge of ancient law proving deeper than Brynja had realized. If we can invoke the right of sacred sanctuary and present evidence of the conspiracy against us, even Jarl Erik would find it difficult to proceed without losing face among his own supporters. But invoking such ancient protections would require proof of the conspiracy, witnesses willing to testify, and allies who could ensure their voices were heard. Most challenging of all, it would require them to step out of hiding and make themselves vulnerable in ways that went against every instinct for protecting the children. Ingrid will report back to her masters within days, Brynja said, thinking through the timeline they faced. Once they know we suspect the connection, they will move quickly to complete their plans before we can act. Then we must move first, Asgrim replied, his hand moving unconsciously to touch the runestone's carved surface. But not in the way they expect. The plan that emerged from their midnight conversation was unlike anything either had originally considered. Instead of defensive preparation or strategic retreat, they would go on the offensive, not with weapons, but with truth. They would gather evidence, seek allies, and force their enemies to fight on ground where honor and law mattered. More than simple strength, the ancient runestone would serve as more than just foundation for their cabin. It would become the foundation for their legal challenge, a symbol of older authorities that preceded the corrupt bargains being made in smoky halls by men who had forgotten that power was meant to serve justice, rather than personal vendetta. As they prepared to take the first steps of this new and dangerous path, Brynja felt the weight of her ancestors' wisdom settling more fully on her shoulders. The memory pendant at her throat grew warm, as if 3 generations of healing women were lending their strength to a battle that would be fought with words and evidence rather than blades and bloodshed. The children slept peacefully in the loft above, unaware that their safety now depended not on hiding from their enemies, but on exposing them to the harsh light of public scrutiny. It was a gamble that could cost them everything, but it was also their best chance of building a future where love and chosen family could exist without fear. Outside, the wind continued its restless song through the pines, but now it seemed to carry whispers of ancient voices, the spirits of those who had once sought sanctuary at this very spot, lending their strength to a new generation of those who dared to stand against corruption and claim protection under laws older than any earthly jarl's authority. The battle for their family's survival was about to begin, but it would be fought in ways that none of their enemies had anticipated. The preparation began before dawn, as Brynja carefully wrapped her most precious possession in layers of oiled cloth. The ancient healing codex had belonged to her bloodline for 7 generations, a collection of handwritten pages bound in leather that had grown soft as silk with age and handling. Within its yellowed pages lay not only the accumulated wisdom of healing women across centuries, but also detailed records of political alliances, corrupt officials, and the networks of power that operated in shadows throughout the Northern Territories. Her great-grandmother had been more than a healer. She had been a keeper of secrets, a woman who understood that knowledge of human nature's darker aspects was sometimes necessary to protect those who sought to do good in the world. The codex contained names, dates, and detailed accounts of conspiracies that reached back decades, including references to the very network that now threatened their family. "Are you certain about this path?" Asgrim asked as he watched her prepare for the journey that would either save them all or doom them to destruction. His own preparations were simpler but no less significant. He wore his father's ceremonial torque, a heavy gold collar that marked him as a man of ancient lineage, with the right to speak before assemblies and invoke protections that even jarls could not easily dismiss. "Certainty is a luxury we cannot afford," Brynja replied, her fingers tracing the codex's worn cover. "But I am certain that hiding will no longer protect the children. If we do nothing, they will come for us with legal authority, backing their personal vendettas. If we act, we at least give truth a chance to prevail." The children had been told they were going on a journey to visit the Great Assembly, the seasonal gathering where disputes were settled and laws were interpreted according to ancient traditions. It was not entirely a lie, though it omitted the deadly stakes involved in their petition for sanctuary and justice. Thorkel, now fully grown into his role as protector of the younger ones, had insisted on carrying the ceremonial war horn that had once belonged to his own father. The curved instrument, carved from the horn of an ancient aurochs and inlaid with silver runes, represented his family's right to call for justice when wronged. Though he was too young to blow it himself in formal assembly, its presence would remind all who saw it that the children were not merely refugees, but the legitimate heirs of honorable bloodlines. "I understand what we face," he told Asgrim as they secured their packs for travel. "But I also understand what we will lose if we remain silent. Better to die with honor than live in fear." The wisdom in those words, spoken by one so young, reminded everyone present of what they were truly fighting to preserve, not just their individual safety, but the right of children to grow up in households built on love rather than fear, guided by wisdom rather than blind tradition. As they prepared to depart, each member of their makeshift family contributed something essential to their cause. Astrid carried samples of the medicinal compounds that proved Brynja's expertise and legitimacy as a healer, evidence that would counter claims of her being a dangerous foreign influence. The twins packed carefully preserved examples of their scholarly work, runic writings and mathematical calculations that demonstrated the quality of education they received in Asgrim's unconventional household. Little Sigrid, whose sharp eyes had uncovered the conspiracy that threatened them, carried her own contribution, a small pouch containing examples of her plant identification work, proof that even the youngest among them was learning valuable skills rather than being corrupted by foreign influences. Young Bjorn, still recovering from his illness but determined to contribute, carried the wooden practice sword Asgrim had carved for him, its surface etched with symbols representing courage, loyalty, and the strength to protect rather than destroy. The journey to the Great Assembly would take 3 days through winter-hardened terrain, and they would be traveling toward those who sought their destruction rather than away from them. But the ancient laws required that appeals for sanctuary be made in person, before witnesses, with evidence presented openly for all to examine. "They will expect us to run," Asgrim said, as they took their final meal in the cabin that had been their sanctuary. "When we appear before the assembly instead, they will be forced to present their accusations publicly. where lies become harder to maintain. The first day of travel passed without incident, though Brynja noticed signs that they were being watched from a distance. Footprints in the snow that appeared and disappeared, the occasional glint of metal from tree-lined shadows, the subtle way forest birds fell silent as they passed certain areas. Their enemies knew of their movement and were tracking their progress, but had not yet moved to intercept them. "They want us to reach the assembly," she realized as they made camp on the first night. "They are confident that their political preparations will ensure our defeat, even in open forum." The second day brought confirmation of this theory when they encountered other travelers on the road, merchants and farmers also heading to the assembly, all of whom had heard whispers about the charges that would be brought against the fallen warrior who harbors foreign corruption and raises children in defiance of proper traditions. The propaganda campaign had been thorough and effective. By the time they reached the assembly grounds, public opinion had already been shaped by carefully planted stories about Asgrim's supposed decline and Brynja's malevolent influence on innocent children. The great assembly itself was an impressive sight. Hundreds of tents and temporary structures erected around an ancient stone circle that had served as a gathering place for justice and governance since time immemorial. The central speaking stone bore carvings that predated written memory, symbols that spoke of laws older than any current ruler's authority, but it was also clearly evident that the gathering had been influenced by those who opposed them. Banners bearing Jarl Eric's colours flew prominently throughout the camp, while supporters of traditional hierarchies clustered in groups that excluded those who might question established authority. "We are outnumbered and outmaneuvered," Thorkel observed with the tactical awareness that belied his youth. "How do we prevail against such organized opposition?" The answer came from an unexpected source. As they established their own modest camp on the assembly's periphery, they were approached by an elderly woman whose bearing spoke of authority earned through decades of respected service. She introduced herself as Solveig the Law Speaker, one of the few remaining individuals who maintained knowledge of the most ancient legal traditions. "I have been watching your approach with interest," she told them, her eyes moving appraisingly over their small group. "Word has reached me of the charges that will be brought, and also of certain irregularities in how those charges have been prepared." She had noticed what others had missed: the coordination between supposedly independent accusers, the identical phrasing in separate testimonies, the presence of marked individuals who served multiple masters. Her own network of information gatherers had uncovered evidence of the conspiracy that sought to use legal mechanisms for personal vengeance. "Ancient law provides remedies for such corruption," she explained, "but invoking them requires courage and absolute commitment to truth. Are you prepared for what such a challenge will demand?" The ritual of sanctuary appeal was complex and dangerous. It required the accused to present themselves voluntarily before their accusers, to challenge the legitimacy of corrupt authority, and to call upon laws so ancient that many no longer remembered their proper application. Failure would result not just in defeat, but in punishments that could extend to every member of their household. "We have come this far," Brynja said, her hand resting on the healing codex that contained evidence spanning generations. "We will see it through to whatever end awaits." As night fell over the assembly grounds, they made their final preparations for the confrontation that would come with dawn. Each member of their family understood their role, carried their appointed symbols, and accepted the risks that came with standing against corruption that had clothed itself in the robes of legitimate authority. The ancient stones seemed to hum with anticipation as representatives of the old ways prepared to challenge those who would pervert tradition for personal gain. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or destruction. But tonight they rested in the knowledge that they had chosen honor over safety, truth over convenience. The codex lay open beside the fire, its pages revealing secrets that could topple powerful men, if those secrets could be presented before they were silenced forever. The morning of judgment broke gray and cold, with frost covering the assembly grounds like a shroud of crystal that caught the pale light and threw it back in 1,000 tiny fragments. The ancient speaking stone stood at the center of the circle, its carved surface bearing witness to centuries of decisions that had shaped the fate of communities and bloodlines. Brynja felt the weight of her ancestors' witness ring heavy on her finger, a simple band of hammered silver that had been worn by 7 generations of healing women when they stood before authority to defend their calling and their choices. The ring bore a single carved symbol, the tree of life, whose roots reached deep while its branches touched the sky. Representing the connection between earthly wisdom and divine justice, the assembly had gathered in formal configuration, with jarls and their supporters arranged according to ancient protocols that dated back to the first gatherings of free men seeking justice under law. Jarl Eric Bloodaxe occupied the position of honor, his banner snapping in the morning wind, while his son Ragnar stood at his right hand with the confident bearing of one who believed the outcome had already been determined. Bjorn Ironside waited among the accusers, his scarred face bearing a smile that held no warmth as he watched Asgrim's small group approach the speaking circle. 30 seasoned warriors flanked him, their presence serving as silent reminder of the violence that would follow if legal means proved insufficient to achieve his desired vengeance. But it was the presence of others that proved most telling. To those who understood the deeper currents at work, merchants bearing the subtle tattoo marks that Sigrid had identified mixed freely among the crowd, their positions chosen to provide maximum intimidation while maintaining the appearance of legitimate assembly attendance. Solveig the law speaker stood beside the ancient stone, her ceremonial staff marking her authority to oversee proceedings according to the oldest traditions. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd. Each word weighted with the authority of centuries. We gather under laws older than any jarl's rule, in a place that has known justice since the gods first granted men the wisdom to settle disputes through words rather than weapons alone. Who brings charges before this assembly, and by what authority do they speak? Ragnar Eriksson stepped forward, his youth and confidence making him an effective spokesman for accusations that older men might deliver with less conviction. I speak for my father, Jarl Eric Bloodaxe, and for the preservation of traditions that have sustained our people since time immemorial. We bring charges against Asgrim, called Wolf-Hewer, who has abandoned the ways of warriors and corrupted innocent children with foreign influences that weaken the strength of our bloodlines. The formal language masked the personal vendetta that drove the accusations, but those trained to recognize such things could hear the careful coordination in how the charges had been crafted. This was not spontaneous justice, but orchestrated persecution dressed in legal robes. What evidence supports these charges? Solveig asked, her ancient eyes moving appraisingly over the accusers. The evidence of our own observation, Bjorn Ironside interjected, stepping forward with the confident swagger of a man who had never been denied what he sought through force. This former warrior has gathered children like a merchant collects coins, raising them in defiance of proper order. He harbors a foreign woman whose strange arts have corrupted their natural development, and what harm has come from this corruption? Solveig pressed, her questions following the ancient patterns required for legitimate accusations. They learn healing arts instead of weapons training, Ragnar replied. They study runes like priests instead of developing the strength of true warriors. The foreign woman has taught them to value preservation over conquest, weakness over power. I see, Solveig said thoughtfully. And who speaks for the accused? Asgrim stepped forward, his father's ceremonial talk catching the morning light as he moved with the controlled grace that had once made him legendary on battlefields across the northern seas. I speak for myself and for the children under my protection. We come before this assembly not to deny what we have done, but to challenge the authority of those who would condemn love as corruption and wisdom as weakness. The word sent a ripple through the assembled crowd. This was not the defensive response they had expected, but a direct challenge that shifted the ground of the entire confrontation. Bold words from one who has forgotten his proper place, Bjorn snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before remembering that violence was forbidden within the speaking circle. "I have forgotten nothing," Asgrim replied, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained him through years of choosing protection over destruction. "I remember every life I took in service to Jarls who measured worth only in blood spilled and gold gathered. I remember every village burned, every family destroyed in pursuit of glory that fed nothing but pride." He gestured toward the children who stood behind him, their young faces serious but unafraid as they faced the assembled power of traditional authority. These children are the survivors of such pursuits. They are proof that strength can build as well as destroy, that families can be forged through choice as well as birth. The ancient witness ring on Brynja's finger grew warm as she prepared to present the evidence that would either vindicate their choices or seal their doom. The moment of final confrontation was at hand. The moment of revelation came when Brynja stepped forward with the healing codex open in her hands, its ancient pages catching the morning light like prophecy made manifest. The assembled crowd fell silent as she began to read from records that stretched back 7 generations. Her voice clear and unwavering, despite the magnitude of what she was about to expose. "By the authority granted to keepers of ancient wisdom, I present evidence of conspiracy against the laws that govern this assembly," she declared, holding up the leather-bound volume so all could see its age and authenticity. "These pages record the network of corruption that seeks to use tradition as a weapon against those who choose different paths." She began with names and dates, reading aloud the detailed accounts her great-grandmother had meticulously recorded of bribes paid, false testimonies given, and justice perverted for personal gain. The tattoo marks that Sigrid had observed were part of a system her ancestors had tracked for decades, a network of agents who served multiple masters and operated in the shadows of legitimate authority. "Ragnar Eriksson bears the mark of this network," she stated, her finger pointing directly at the young man who had grown pale as the implications of her words became clear, as did the spy who called herself Ingrid Farwalker, sent to assess our defenses while pretending to bring innocent news. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the careful coordination behind the accusations became visible. But Brynja was not finished. From deeper within the codex, she produced documents that detailed financial arrangements, payments made by Bjorn Ironside to various officials in exchange for legal cover for his planned vengeance. "Ancient law forbids the corruption of justice for personal gain," Solveig intoned, her voice carrying the weight of centuries as she examined the evidence. "If these records prove authentic, then the charges themselves become invalid, brought by those who have violated the very traditions they claim to defend." Bjorn Ironside's control finally snapped. "Lies!" he roared, stepping toward the speaking circle with murder in his eyes. "Foreign witchcraft and forged documents. I will not be denied justice by the tricks of a barren woman who corrupts everything she touches." But his outburst had revealed too much. The formal language carefully prepared by his conspirators crumbled under the pressure of raw hatred, exposing the personal vendetta that drove everything they had done. Around the assembly circle, those who had remained neutral began to shift their positions as the true nature of the accusations became clear. Thorkel chose that moment to step forward with his father's ceremonial war horn, its silver inlays gleaming as he held it high for all to see. Though too young to blow the instrument formally, his right to carry it was unquestioned, a visual reminder that the children were not merely refugees but the legitimate heirs of honorable bloodlines. "I speak for those who cannot speak for themselves," he declared with a dignity that belied his years. "For every child who has lost family to wars, fought for gold rather than justice, For every orphan who has been told they are worthless because they lack the protection of blood relatives, Astrid joined him, carrying samples of the medicinal compounds that proved both her learning and Brynja's legitimate expertise. We have been taught to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. If this makes us weak in your eyes, then we embrace that weakness gladly. The twins stepped forward together, their synchronized movement speaking of bonds forged through shared survival. We choose to stand with those who protected us when the world offered only abandonment. Little Sigrid, whose sharp eyes had uncovered the conspiracy, held up her collection of properly identified plants. We learn to help things grow instead of cutting them down. Finally, young Bjorn raised his practice sword, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of strength channeled toward protection rather than conquest. We are not broken by what we have lost. We are made stronger by what we choose to build. The cumulative impact of their testimony, combined with the documented evidence of corruption, created a turning point that even the conspirators could not have anticipated. Murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the crowd as people recognized the courage it had taken for this small family to stand before such overwhelming opposition. Solveig studied the evidence carefully, her ancient fingers tracing the coded entries that revealed decades of systematic corruption. When she finally spoke, her words carried the authority of laws that predated any current ruler's power. By the ancient right of sanctuary, by the evidence of corruption presented, and by the testimony of those who have chosen wisdom over tradition, I declare these charges invalid and these accusers in violation of the very laws they claim to uphold. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of such decisions. Justice had been served, but the full implications of that justice were only beginning to unfold. Bjorn Ironside's face had turned the color of old blood, his plans crumbling like leaves before fire as the political support he had cultivated vanished in the face of exposed corruption. The moment of victory had arrived, but with it came the knowledge that their enemies would not accept defeat gracefully. The true test of their triumph was yet to come. 6 months later, as spring's first green shoots pushed through the forest floor around their cabin, Brynja sat by the window watching the children tend their expanded garden. The healing stones her grandmother had passed down rested on the windowsill, their carved surfaces catching the warm afternoon light that spoke of winter's final retreat and the promise of abundant seasons ahead. The changes wrought by their victory at the great assembly had rippled far beyond their small household. Solveig's ruling had exposed a network of corruption that reached into multiple Jarl's territories, triggering investigations that toppled several officials and led to reforms in how ancient laws were applied and interpreted. The tattoo-marked agents who had operated in shadows found themselves scattered to distant lands, their network dismantled by authorities who could no longer ignore the evidence of systematic abuse. Bjorn Ironside himself had fled north rather than face the consequences of his exposed conspiracy. Some said he had taken ship for distant shores where his reputation might still carry weight. Others whispered that he had fallen to the justice of those he had wronged in his quest for vengeance. Asgrim preferred not to know which was true. His former companion had chosen his path just as Asgrim had chosen his own. "The new healing hall is taking shape nicely," Asgrim said, joining Brynja at the window. Through the trees, they could see the framework of a larger structure rising beside their original cabin. Word of their victory had brought others seeking the kind of sanctuary they provided. More orphaned children, yes, but also adults who had been cast out for failing to conform to traditional expectations. There was Ulf the Gentle, a former warrior whose refusal to participate in raids against innocent settlements had earned him exile from his clan. His skills in woodworking and defensive construction had proven invaluable as their community grew. Beside him worked Thora the Wise, an elderly woman whose knowledge of law and tradition rivaled Solveig's own. She had come seeking a place where wisdom was valued over the blind adherence to custom that had marginalized her in her home. Village, 17 children now, Brynja mused, watching as Astrid taught a group of newcomers to identify medicinal plants, while Thorkel supervised the construction of new sleeping alcoves. And 6 adults who bring their own skills and stories. The healing stones seemed to pulse with warmth, as if her ancestors approved of how their legacy was being expanded and shared. The small river rocks had become symbols of continuity, reminders that knowledge and compassion could survive even the darkest times when carried by those brave enough to protect them. Little Sigrid, now 8 winters old and even sharper of eye than before, had appointed herself the official greeter for new arrivals. She had a gift for seeing past surface wounds to the healing potential that lay beneath, much like Brynja herself had learned to do. Today, she guided a girl perhaps her own age who had lost both parents to a plague that swept through the coastal settlements, showing her the best places to gather eggs, the warm spots near the fire for evening stories, the hiding places where treasures could be kept safe. The twins had grown taller and more confident, their synchronized movements now including defensive techniques that Asgrim taught to all the older children, not for conquest, but for the protection of those who could not protect themselves. They had become leaders among the younger ones, their shared experience of loss and recovery making them natural teachers of resilience. Young Bjorn, fully recovered from his illness and fierce as ever, had taken particular interest in the newcomers who arrived, bearing physical wounds or disabilities. His own brush with mortality had given him an understanding of vulnerability that made him especially gentle with those who struggled. He carved walking sticks for those who needed them, fashioned adaptive tools for hands that no longer worked as they once had, and shared his own story of being cared for when he could not care for himself. As evening approached and the community gathered for their customary meal around the expanded hearth, Brynja felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with endings and everything to do with purposes fulfilled. The healing codex now rested in a place of honor on a specially built shelf, its ancient pages copied by careful hands so that the wisdom it contained could be preserved and shared. "Do you ever regret it?" Asgrim asked as they watched the mixed generations of their chosen family settle into comfortable conversation. "The path that brought you here?" Brynja touched the memory pendant at her throat, feeling the warmth that always came when she thought of her grandmother's blessing. "How can I regret a path that led me to discover what family truly means? I spent years believing I was broken because I could not create life the traditional way. Now I know there are many ways to nurture growth, many ways to leave a legacy that matters." Through the window, the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, their light reflecting off the healing stones and casting gentle patterns on the cabin's walls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did. There would be more children in need of sanctuary, more adults seeking places where their differences were strengths rather than weaknesses, more opportunities to prove that love chosen freely was stronger than bonds imposed by convention. But tonight, in this place where healing had triumphed over harm and wisdom had prevailed over willful ignorance, peace reigned absolute. The children's laughter mingled with adult conversations, creating the symphony of a family that had been built not through accident of birth, but through deliberate acts of courage, compassion, and hope. The healing stones caught the last light of day and held it, glowing softly like promises kept and futures secured, through the simple act of choosing love over fear, again and again, until that choice became the foundation upon which everything else could safely rest. Outside, the wind sang through the pines with what sounded remarkably like approval, carrying their story toward distant places where other families waited to be born, from the courage to believe that home was not a place you were given, but a sanctuary you built with your own hands and protected with your own heart.